Hello and welcome to Polk Pioneers. My name is Shelley Drummond. I'm the Curator of Education and Programming at the Polk County History Center. And today I am joined by Dr. Wylie Koon, the retired family practitioner from Winter Haven. But Mr. Koon, where were you born?
I was born in Lakeland.
You were?
Lakeland, Polk County, Florida. At the old Morrell Memorial Hospital, which has evolved into the Lakeland Regional Health as of just recently.
What year were you born?
1928.
So do you remember much about the Depression?
I do not, because I was just a child then. I do recall hearing about it from a number of places, and one thing that I identified with was a friend of my brother's. My brother was 6 years older than I. This friend of his was telling about his experience when he was a child, that there was no food in the house, and that he remembers crying because there was no food in the house and his tummy hurt when he was hungry. I remember that, and I remember hearing about how so many people were not able to work and because there was no work for them. And then I heard stories about the WPA and the CCC and those government programs that came out to help alleviate the misery on the people caused by the Depression.
So what was it like in Lakeland when you were growing up?
Lakeland was a small town. The population of 1940 was something like 10,580, and we were overshadowed by Tampa, and we were always concerned about whether Lakeland was bigger and better than Orlando or not. And then Mr. Disney came along with his venture and took care of that question once and for all. Downtown Lakeland was about all there was at that time. And then, of course, during Second World War, Dixieland came along, and I remember the development of the stores out there at Dixieland. And then gradually things spread on out, and Lakeland is rather vast now. In fact, my wife and I went for a little ride around Lakeland here a couple of, maybe 6 weeks ago, and it was astounding to me to see how much development there has been in North Lakeland, north of Lake Gibson. And so Lakeland has become a significant place, significant town, and I'm very proud when I tell people that I was born and reared in Lakeland.
Now, you mentioned World War II. What are some of your memories of growing up in Polk County during World War II?
Well, in World War II, as you may recall from the history books, on September 1, 1939, I was awakened by hearing somebody yell, "Extra, extra," and they were selling extra editions of newspapers. You may recall movies about significant events happening, and the boy would be down there waving his extra edition of the newspaper. So I knew from having heard things on the radio that, okay, the war had started, which they'd been anticipating. And so I had to run downtown and get myself a job also selling those nickel a piece extra editions of the Lakeland Ledger. The Lakeland Evening Ledger and Star Telegram was the name of it then. As a matter of fact, the Ledger was an afternoon newspaper in those days. And I remember that. And I do remember that the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force pilot trainees came to Lakeland, to Lodwick Airport, which is now Tiger Town. And they did a lot of their flight training there, and we lived on an orange grove north of Lake Gibson. And I remember being out in the grove, and these airplane trainees craft would be flying all around, and that went on until Pearl Harbor, and then of course we had to do our own training, I guess. And of course during that time, during the Second World War, Drain Field opened, which was named for the Congressman, Mr. Drain, and they had B-24 Liberator bomber training going on there. The Liberator was a four-motor airplane similar to the Boeing B-17, the Flying Fortress. And So I remember all that. I do remember, as I told you earlier when we were talking, that we used to go to the municipal pool, swimming pool that the city of Lakeland ran out near where the Lakeland General Health is now. And at the swimming pool, those RAF trainees would be there swimming, and we were astounded to see how pale their skin was. They didn't have any tanning at all. They were just white like the page of a book, and we were astounded to see how white they were. And we also wondered why they didn't turn red from the sunshine being exposed like that. I remember that, and I do remember that my wife Sarah and I were having lunch at the Winter Haven Gilbert Airport, Municipal Airport, not too long ago, and there was one of those trainee planes there, and I guess you could purchase a ticket and they'd give you a ride in one of them. We decided not to take that ride.
What about rationing? Do you remember rationing?
Yes, I certainly do. I remember that gasoline rationing was graded by what the person did, and the base thing was an A ticket. They gave books of coupons, and the A coupon allowed you to have 4 gallons of gas a week. And of course, I guess that lasted a little bit longer because the speed limit was 35 miles an hour. And so there was a lot of jockeying around to get your gasoline and have enough to do what you wanted to do and not get caught for speeding over 35. It was all difficult to do. I remember that Coca-Colas were unavailable, sugar was unavailable, and ice cream was pretty much unavailable. That's among the things that I remember now. And I do remember that as a member of the choir at First Presbyterian Church in Lakeland, boy soprano, a group of us were asked and organized to do some entertaining for the USO. Some of the soldiers who were stationed close by Lakeland, and we'd go out, and I do remember they gave us some coffee, and I was able to reach into the great big old drum of sugar, real sugar, to put in my coffee. I remember that. So and it was an interesting time.
Now, did you get a chance to go to the Florida Citrus Festival?
Florida Citrus Festival in those days was known as the Orange Festival, and it was the thing that along with Cypress Gardens is what put Winter Haven on the map for Lakelanders anyway. We looked forward to every year. I think it was January, may have been February, but I do remember every year we get all excited that we were going to be taken to the Orange Festival and go over and see the exhibits and ride the rides. And that's what Winter Haven meant to us in those days. And then later on, Mr. Pope founded Cypress Gardens, and Cypress Gardens became a real attraction for us, and we would take company that would come see us, like relatives from up north or friends that may come see us. And we'd take them to Cypress Gardens and then on over to Bach Tower at Mountain Lake, and that was our one-day entertainment for those people. Cypress Gardens was very interesting, very beautiful, very well organized. And then I do remember that the ski shows came along, and we used to watch the ski shows. That was an innovation by Mrs. Pope, the founder's wife, and that became very famous. So, and one other thing I recall about Cypress Gardens was in those days the bridges over the canals were wooden, and we being a couple of my high school classmates and I were out there one Sunday, and one of the people put her hand on one of the railings and it fell off into the water, and one of us almost fell off with it, but we didn't. And so that I remember about Winter Haven. And I also remember that Winter Haven was at one time a site for internment of prisoners of war from the European theater. I remember that.
Did you ever see any of them, or?
No, no. We had a doctor when I first came on the staff at Winter Haven in 1961 who was affiliated with the camp, the prisoners' camp. I think he was a physician for that camp. But he never talked about it with me, but I do understand that he did that.
Now, you've talked about doctors. Do you have any recollections of the early Watson Clinic in the Marble Arcade?
Watson Clinic, well, you know, my father was a doctor and a general practitioner. They did everything in those days. And I remember that his office was on South Florida Avenue, but most of the doctors had their offices at the Marble Arcade building. The Marble Arcade building, being 10 stories high, was the tallest thing around. And I remember going to New York City when we were children and looking up at those big skyscrapers and thinking they don't look so much taller than the Marble Arcade. And well, anyway, the Marble Arcade was the home of the Watson Clinic, as I first knew the Watson Clinic. They had the entire 8th floor and part of the 9th floor. And then after that, somewhere along in the 50s, I'm going to say right around the first part of the 1950s, the Thelma Hotel, which was located across the street from the Marble Arcade, sold off a wing to the Watson Clinic. They renovated and the Watson Clinic was there and started to grow, and they grew to the point that they purchased property out on Lakeland Hills Boulevard and built the first of their buildings, and it has become a massive organization, and as far as I know, it's internationally known. I do know they had some very renowned physicians there, and I felt privileged to know a few of them, mainly from my days of riding an ambulance with a job I had with one of the local funeral homes.
So tell me about one of the doctors that you knew. I believe you mentioned Dr. Annis.
Dr. Annis. Well, Dr. Annis became the managing partner from the pool of the physicians who were there. And when I was a senior in medical school at University of Miami, Dr. Annis came to talk with us one day about group practice. The days of the single solo practitioner were winding down and people were forming partnerships and groups, and he talked with us about the various things about group practice. And then afterwards, after that lecture was over and Dr. Annis was awaiting his ride to the airport for his flight back to Lakeland, I was lucky enough to be in a room with him, and he and I had a one-on-one conversation for some 20-25 minutes in which he gave me the advice to seek out employment with Dr. Tanner. Dr. Tanner was a practitioner in Auburndale, and he hired me, and I worked with Dr. Tanner for 3 years before coming on over to Winter Haven to open my own practice there. The reason for Winter Haven was because Auburndale was only 4 miles from Winter Haven, and we did our hospital practice at the Winter Haven Hospital, and so that was only natural that I would go to Winter Haven because the bulk of my practice was near Winter Haven, and I was already on the staff of the Winter Haven Hospital. So that started a long association with the Winter Haven Hospital.
Do you have any fun stories about maybe some of your first experiences with Dr. Tanner, or maybe some ideas that you had?
One thing in particular, Dr. Tanner wrote a book about, it was his old autobiography, and he told some practice stories. And one of the things he dedicated some space to was when he hired me, that I told him that I wanted to make house calls. And the basis for that was because my father made house calls, and I had a lot of identification with my father, and he used to take me on house calls with him, and I'd sit out in the car and wait for him and wonder what was going on in there. So I wanted to make house calls, and Dr. Tanner told me, you'll have plenty of opportunity to make house calls. We charge $6 for each house call, and but I'll tell you what, he said, I'm going to write it down that you said you like to make house calls. And so he wrote it down on a piece of paper and promised that the day would come when he would tell me to eat that piece of paper. And that day came. I told him one day I wasn't all that crazy about making all those house calls anymore. They were too time consuming. And he said, here. He went to his desk, fished it out, handed it to him, and said, "It's ready for you to eat." And I said, "No salt and pepper, I'm not going to do that." So that, I remember that. And so.
Well, I have a few questions. We have done some leaping there from high school all the way into being a doctor. But I know that there were some things that happened in between. Did you, right after high school, did you go directly into college to be a doctor?
I did not. I went to a mortuary college in Nashville, Tennessee, because I was going to be a mortician. We lived across the street from a funeral home, and in those days, the funeral homes provided the ambulance service. And I was privileged to get a job working there because they had a manpower shortage, so they came to boy power. I was 15 years old, and they hired me, and so that led to my desire to be a funeral director, and went on to indeed become a licensed funeral director. And that was fortuitous because it led to my being able to pay my way through Florida Southern College. My father got ill, lay down and died, and we had no money. And so Florida Southern College allowed me to work in that funeral home and have unlimited class absences and tardiness because of unanticipated funeral calls and things like that. And so that's why I'm wearing this red coat, is as a token of appreciation to Florida Southern College for giving me that opportunity. That led to being able to further my education on to have the privilege of someday becoming a doctor myself.
Now that was during some of the earlier days of Florida Southern College. Do you have any memories to share about that?
When I went to Florida Southern College, they had the three buildings, the three red brick buildings that they had. They had the Allen Spivey Hall, and I can't think of the other two right now, but that was all before Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright came along, and they finished the construction of the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel in 1941. And one of the times I went to chapel, and Mr. Wright himself spoke, and I heard him make the often quoted statement he made, that he knew he was arrogant, but that he would rather be honestly arrogant than hypocritically humble. And I thought that was, I wasn't too crazy about him. He did seem awfully sold on himself, but then he deserved that. He did it for himself, and I have a book of his pictorial description of a lot of his works, and some of them are just plain beautiful. And then of course the Frank Lloyd Wright campus is now pretty large, a large segment of Florida Southern, and it is beautiful, and it is distinct, unique.
Now, how did you blend classwork with driving an ambulance? Because it would seem to me that an ambulance you have to...
Well, the man I worked for needed a licensed personnel. The place I had worked for before didn't need licensed personnel, and this man did. And so he paid me $175 a month, $150 of which went to Florida Southern College, and he made it possible for me to go to class by having other people there, part-time people, some of his friends, to cover for things like going on ambulance calls and other calls. That funeral home in which I worked was low-volume funeral home, so that was also a break for me because I didn't have as many funerals and things to have to miss class for, and also I had plenty of study time because in that business in those days there was a lot of sitting around to do because you wouldn't be busy, and so you could sit around and study, and so that was interesting to me to recollect all that.
Were there other things that you learned working at a funeral home about maybe dealing with people that you've used in your...
Dealing with people, probably was the best lesson I learned, especially getting experience at dealing with people in their times of stress and bereavement. Yeah, as a really young person, all that high school and college frivolity and stuff, didn't take things so seriously, but I learned to take people's distress and misery seriously. I'm not crazy about Halloween things because to me they mock death, and I know the basis of that is because that's what we fear is dying, but I still don't see anything funny about death. I have a son who portrays himself as Dr. Paul Bearer II, after the original Paul Bearer, which some of you may recall was a television character in the 70s and 80s, and my son got permission from his widow to carry that on, and he dresses up like Dr. Paul Bearer and makes appearances, and he currently is hosts a show on TV station 44, and it's on Sunday afternoons where he has this little dialogue where he makes all these corny, silly jokes and then presents the picture that they're going to do that day.
And I like the fact that your father was a doctor, you're a doctor, and you have another son that's a doctor?
I have a son now, excuse me, I'm getting hoarse. I have a son now who is a podiatrist and has his boards in foot surgery. I'm very proud of him. He's on the staff at the Winter Haven Hospital, and he's the immediate past chairman of the section of podiatry. And he's soon to be joining the Bond Clinic. I'd been asked not to say anything about that until just recently. I was given permission to state that my son is closing his current office and is joining the Department of Orthopedics at Bond Clinic. And he's proud of being a bit of a pioneer in that you don't hear very much about podiatrists being asked to join practicing orthopedists in their department of orthopedics. It's much like optometrists used not to work with ophthalmologists. The glasses doctors with the surgeons, now they work together, and it's good for the people that they have these services in conjunction with each other and so ready to cooperate with each other. And so that's the doctor in our family now.
So tell me a little bit about your experience and accomplishments as a physician.
I've learned that there is a God, and it has strengthened my religious tenets just to know that I was able to accomplish getting into medical school, which was the hardest part about medical school, and knowing that I had that hand on my shoulder that helped so much. I was so privileged to have the Winter Haven Hospital ask me to function as the hospital doctor, in which I did physical examinations for the newly acquired personnel, employees, and so forth. And the one proviso that I made when I took that job was that that would include the nurses. And so one of the nurses came along in the office and I did her physical examination, and that was in 1948, and in 1986 that young lady and I were married. And so Sarah and I have been married for 28 years, and so I'd have never met her were it not for being a medical physician. And as a physician, I also was privileged to do the medical work for the Cypress Gardens. They came to me, and I was able to do their work and met with the ski performers, did their physical examinations, took care of their injuries, took care of the health of tourists when they would become sick when they were here. One of them in particular was a man who came up from Miami to see Cypress Gardens, and he was staying in the hotel across the road from Cypress Gardens entrance. And the only thing he got to see of Cypress Gardens was from his window, because he had a devastating heart attack, which he got to the hospital and the heart doctor saw him and all that, but he did not make it. He died. And I remember that. I remember having the movie star Cornell Wilde get hurt, and they brought him into my office, and we knew he was coming, so one of the girls cut out a star from a piece of foil and put on the treatment door for him, and Mr. Wilde was very personable, and we got along very well. I was also privileged to be asked to be the physician for the Boston Red Sox when they were in Winter Haven for spring training, and we had that job for some 13 years, and got to know a number of those people, and ancillary help too, such as writers. And one time one of the umpires came in, one of the major league umpires, and I'll tell you, you don't mess with those people. And he came in and assumed his position behind the home plate to call strikes and balls, because he had to demonstrate the afflicted area on his leg for me to examine, and that was interesting, just a little bit of an interesting thing. And so every time I'd read a box score, I'd see who the umpire was to see if it were that man. And
how did you get that job?
I was at a ball game one day, and one of the New York Yankee batters was hit by a pitch, hit in the head, knocked to the ground, and the catcher, whom I knew, called me onto the field, and so we went to the clubhouse with this player, and I had him hospitalized because it was a head injury, and the Boston Red Sox physician, Dr. Pappas in Boston, called me and complimented me for putting the man in the hospital because of the head injury, and he stated that was his policy, that all beanings would be hospitalized. And so I got that job and got to know Dr. Pappas real well. Excellent doctor, excellent man, and he'd come down to spring training, and we'd go over the various players and the problems, and they even had one player that was giving them some trouble, and I took care of the medical aspects of that. It was a very interesting thing. And as a matter of fact, the highlight of that thing was when I went to a medical meeting near Boston. Sarah and I were privileged to go to a ball game at Fenway Park and sit in the owner's box in Dr. Pappas' 2 seats, and I met the Yankees and saw the game from the owner's box. And it would have been a daydream come true. So
you got to see a lot of the games then?
Yes, as I told you earlier, we were required to be at the game. One of us had to be at the game. There were 2 of us at that time, and Dr. Rayful and I, and we had to go, but I still had to buy my ticket. So, yeah, we got to see a lot of the games.
Did they give you a parking spot?
He did. He gave me a parking spot. I parked there one time only, and that was because that one time I parked there, a ball was hit off a bat from the minor league fields, which were next to the major league field, and the ball went through my back window of the car. I still have the ball. And so that was the last time I parked there. So I parked with everybody else after that. Besides, the walk did me good.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of your experience at Winter Haven Hospital.
Winter Haven Hospital was a 1-story conglomerate of 3 or 4 wings, and in 1967 they were able to open the newly built 8-floor Swan Tower. And that was a vast improvement to the hospital space, and they were able to purchase state-of-the-art material and have a place for it. The X-ray department was able to purchase some real updated things. CAT scans came along, and the Winter Haven Hospital was right there to get a CAT scan machine, and hired the properly trained personnel to run those things, and they continued with that all along. The Winter Haven Hospital, when I was there, really started to turn around under the supervision of Mel Arnold. Mel Arnold was the administrator then, and they named the newly built emergency department after Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold got the mental health program started at Winter Haven Hospital. Had a whole floor, the 5th floor, dedicated for the mental health inpatient and outpatient services. They were able to expand that onto another building, the Strang unit, and that was a child psychiatry wing, so they had that. It was pretty exclusive for this whole area. And then sometime after Mel Arnold's tenure as administrator, Lance Anastasio came along. And Lance continued being right on top of everything. He was always right there on any newly innovative thing that came along, and saw to it that it went to the board. And the Winter Haven Hospital has had exceptionally successful and dedicated people on that board all along. And they saw to it that the Winter Haven Hospital was able to be a state-of-the-art facility. As a matter of fact, we had, and I guess I don't know how much this is true now, but back then in the 70s and even the 80s, Winter Haven Hospital was the only thing in this area, central part of the state. We had Orlando to our east and Tampa to our west. And then Lakeland was Lakeland Regional Health Hospital. That was mostly just Lakeland. So Winter Haven Hospital drew from all up and down Central Florida, all the way down as far as Clewiston. They would send patients to our hospital for specialty care. We had a neurosurgical group come over here from Lakeland and open their office here, and it has expanded into having both a contingency of neurosurgeons as well as neurologists. And they brought in an MRI machine, and so Winter Haven has been very fortunate to have Winter Haven and the surrounding areas have been very fortunate to have that kind of care. Now along has come Bartow. Bartow Memorial Hospital has become prestigious, and that has been over the last 10, 15 years. And I'm proud to say that I live in Polk County, from Polk County, and that we have places like medical facilities such as Bartow Memorial and Winter Haven Hospital, as well as Lakeland Regional and the Watson Clinic.
And in your time practicing, there's been a lot of different changes. I think you had told me that you began as a general practitioner and then moved, and then the family practitioner developed.
When I well, general practitioners were it for so many years. I remember in Lakeland there were Dr. Tillis was the ear, nose, and throat specialist. That was before I broke off to ophthalmology. And Dr. Bowler was the pediatrician in town, and that was just about it for specialists. The Watson Clinic brought in a surgeon. I have a senior moment right now and can't think of his name, but anyway, it was general practice. And then we started having people, unfortunately, people who weren't really, I don't know how to say it and be nice about it, but we had people who weren't really stalwart in their given fields, and they'd start seeing Granny's tonsils and things like that. And so a group of physicians, mainly at the University of Kentucky, started a thing called the American Academy of General Practice. And from that evolved a board status, a board creation, the American Board of Family Practice. And in those days, you had to take 3 days of examinations to become boarded in family practice. I remember my board certification came in the mail in 1972, and I was very proud to get that. And that has evolved into a residency now, American Medical Association approved residency in family practice, which is some 3 years after medical school. And they specialize, they take special training in various fields of medicine, not necessarily do everything. A lot of what the family practitioners do now is based upon where their practice is. If they're in the rural areas, they would do things like obstetrics, whereas it became unheard of to do obstetrics like somebody like me, where there's a sea of specialists, obstetricians and all that. And so it has evolved into a specialty, and they have extra training in medicine, for example. Mine was medicine and psychiatry, and others will do pediatrics, and some will do emergency medicine. That's another thing that has come along, is emergency medicine. It used to be that the emergency department of the hospital was for acute emergencies, principally accidents. And now so many people go to the emergency room for their care, even for their acute care, and that has become a specialty since I went into practice.
So you were a significant leader at Winter Haven Hospital. What were some of the last roles that you played before you retired?
I would not say I was a leader. I was a better follower than leader. I was privileged to be the president of the medical staff after being chairman of medicine, and I was also privileged to be chairman of the executive committee after being president of the medical staff. That way I got to know all the people on the staff, got to know some of the people's idiosyncrasies, and learned some medicine from it too, by going to hearings and interviews and meetings.
Now, is there anything you would like to add that we haven't talked about to the interview?
No, I can't think of anything from the historical standpoint right now. I do have concern about the future of medicine. We have so many agencies and requirements, and I know one of our internists, who was very well respected, retired a few years earlier because he became very disgruntled over the fact that we started having so much paperwork to do. You had to fill out all these forms to justify your doing whatever you were doing, and it all evolved around charges, monetary charges, fees and all. And I guess some of that's okay, but it has evolved into being it became a bit of a nightmare. I do know that I did a lot of referring of, like I say, I was practicing in an area where there were so many specialists that you had to know your limitations. And if you went over your limitations, that was really not good at all. It was actually not moral for you to try to practice beyond your limitations on people when there was a specialist in that particular field right around the corner. And I used to do a lot of that referring, and I got word from one of the insurance companies that they were particularly unhappy with me because I was getting so many consultations, and they were having to pay the insurance things, and they were going to cut me down where they weren't going to pay for my patient visits because I cost them too much money by sending people to the specialists, and I regret that sort of thing. And I never abused calling on specialists when they weren't needed to be called. On the other hand, I never was foolish enough to try to practice beyond my limitations. You get your thumbs wet.
Well, thank you for joining us today for Polk Pioneers. I've been speaking with Dr. Wylie Koon, and thank you for sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you very much for this privilege. I do very much appreciate it, and good luck to you and the organization.